So in this video, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the aggregate supply and demand model, and I'm just going to try and hit kind of the big highlights. I'm not going to go really in depth like I did with the supply and demand model because they're very, very similar. They're just talking about different levels of production. And what I mean by different levels is that the supply and demand model, normally we're talking about one market. And in the aggregate supply and demand model, we're talking about all of the markets added together. And a lot of the same things still apply, but there are a couple things that are different, and I just want to point out the differences. So the first, and in my mind the biggest difference, is that aggregate supply hits this wall, like right about here. So before we had a supply line that was just upward sloping like this, and we called that supply. And we kind of assumed that it just kept on sloping upwards, that it never really hit a wall. But with aggregate supply, what this wall is we call this the long run aggregate supply, and it's always abbreviated LRAS. And what this is that if the economy is producing at full capacity, it's producing as much as it can, there's not really anything else that you can do to make it produce more. It doesn't matter if you raise the price, everyone is already working as hard as they can. All of the outputs are already being used, all of the inputs are already being used, they're producing as much output as possible, and there's not really any room to budge. So it's theorized in this model that there is this kind of wall that the economy hits in the long run that's called the long run aggregate supply, above which any increase in demand can't increase supply anymore. So that's the one big thing. The second big thing is that the price level, when you get into this long run part of the aggregate supply curve, the price level is determined by aggregate demand. So here at AD4, the fourth aggregate demand, we have a price level that's about here, and I'm going to call this P4 just to be consistent. And then if we go up to the next aggregate demand line, aggregate demand 5, we still have the exact same level of production. We're still at this long run aggregate supply level. We haven't increased the amount supplied or the amount consumed at all, but the price level is higher. And so here we're at P5, which is obviously higher than P4. So in the long run, when we're at the long run aggregate supply, or this is also called full employment GDP, and there's a lot of other names that are given to it, but they all kind of mean the same thing. It's full employment GDP because everyone's working as hard as they can. So when you are there, the aggregate demand curve determines the price level. If you are not there, aggregate demand and aggregate supply then work together to determine the amount of real GDP. So if we are, let's say that we're at we'll call this point B because it matches up with aggregate demand too. So if we're at point B and aggregate demand decreases to AD1, so we go from AD2 to AD1, from point B to point A, then we have, whereas when we shifted from AD4 to AD5 we only changed price, now we have also changed quantity, or in this case real GDP, which we'll call Y. So here we went from Y2 to Y1. And so when you're on this non-full employment part of the line, both real GDP will shift, and also we can see here's P1 and here's P2, and also the price level will shift. So then you just need to be able to work with what shifts aggregate demand and what shifts aggregate supply, and those are really the same things as in the supply and demand model. And so I'm not really going to go into those too much, but hopefully this is a good overview. If you feel like you need more review, let me know, but I think that should do it.